Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 70, Troubles with Tiny Text, a look at lettering. Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Takeup. As you can see, I'm having a little trouble with my green screen. Pardon me for that. But hey, guys, been kind of a weird technical problem kind of day today. I have to assume that some of you have had some similar problems if you're streaming or if you're doing stuff like that, but hopefully it has cleared up for most of you. Suffice it to say, despite the slightly late startup, we are definitely going to get into this and get into small lettering as far as just lettering in general, folks, because it's something that I continually work on and something that I continually teach. And no matter what I am doing, I will eventually have to talk about lettering. And as you know, if you've been watching the show for the past 70 episodes or any portion thereof, I've talked about lettering several times in the course of the Take-Up. Honestly, it is one of those times that I will say, no matter what else you do in embroidery, you will be discussing, you will be dealing with things like small detail and definitely lettering. Lettering is always an issue. Small lettering is always an issue. So there's no reason why we can't repeat this. And there's no reason why I shouldn't repeat this as a subject for the Take-Up. So first, let's go ahead and say hi to some folks and get things started off. All right. So Cindy King in from Texas. Cindy, thank you for being here. Lyndon in from North Carolina. Lyndon, thank you for being here as well. Curtis is in from Kansas. Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd and of Fuller Embroidery Works, digitizer himself and educator. Happy to have you in here. Carol Wilson is in from Willamette Valley in Oregon. Happy to have you in. Philip Hertz says good evening. So I'm assuming you are part of the Across the Pond group, Philip. Christine says, referring to the other shows I've done already today, hi, Eric. I wondered if you would be solo on the half today. I almost offered to guest host if you needed this morning, but thought you would have made arrangements already. I'll be honest with you on that one. I thought the scheduling for Aaron not being in would be next week and the week after, not this week. And so that is on me, apparently, or at least on poor communication. We should have talked about that earlier. But suffice it to say, that is something that I would have dealt with differently. But we'll have a guest host next week for sure. I'm going to arrange that for sure. So let's talk to a few other people who are here. Crystal says, hi, everyone, and hello from Mike Muldowney. Hope everyone is doing well. Same here. Hope everybody, all of you reciprocators out there from reciprocator number one and me, hope you guys are doing well. Lisa says, hey there. Lisa Shaw, my compatriot at Embrilliance and also at Sew Bubbles, her own work as educator and embroiderer of great standing. Hey there. Yes, you are immersed in lettering. Absolutely. If I've been living in patch land, I've also been living in lettering land. So we'll definitely discuss some things related to that. Absolutely. And also, folks, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to share your own input, I would love to have you discuss this with us. So by all means, get into the comments. If you're live, share. I will bring up comments. I'm going to talk to people throughout the episode. And if you have questions, if you have things that you're having trouble with, if you're dealing with issues, please bring them up. Let's talk about them here. I would love to get derailed by a great question, because that's one of the things about doing the topics repeatedly, which, like I said, small lettering is going to be a topic we hit repeatedly. Blending is a topic we hit repeatedly. Art approval, art interpretation, density, dimension. Some of these things are going to happen over and over and over again. I'm happy to have people jump in and actually deal with this live with me. So please jump in and say what you want to say. Linda's waiting. Hi, Linda. Amy says, hi, Eric. Hi, Amy. Happy to have you in here. DJ Anderson, digitizer and educator himself. Hello from Knoxville, Tennessee. Hi, DJ. Letty Walker is in. Hi, guys. And Chris says, I'm catching this live. Yes, you are, Chris, as your comment will show you. So like I said, if you have questions about lettering or small lettering or typography in general, let's talk about those today, because that is what we are here to do. All right. As I usually do, folks, I'm going to go ahead and bring in the links list link. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. Some of the materials are here. Some of them are not. But I like to give you some additional materials to talk about amongst yourselves, or for additional reading or viewing later down the road if you care to. So there's a few of these things that you have probably seen before from me, but may be helpful, may be useful. Number one is this piece from Images Magazine, Easy as ABC. I think it's a nice piece, and actually we'll discuss it in more detail as we get going here. I'm going to use this to talk a little bit about lettering, but certainly talks about the way in which I break up lettering and what I think about planning and settings, and also strokes and the way that we have to deal with scale. So we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Certainly, certainly we'll talk about overlaps. We'll talk about safe lettering sizes, things like that. But suffice it to say, this is one of the articles we'll be going to, and that's first on the list. We also have a couple episodes of the Takeup. Number one, the machine embroidered lettering episode. I'm sure we're going to cover some of the same stuff in the machine embroidered lettering episode. What I will say is somebody recently brought up one of my previous webinars to me that I wanted to cover some material from. And I've been working on micro lettering, micro fonts myself. So this is something that I am currently steeped in. So I may have some different attitudes or some different things to talk about now than I did then, for sure. The other ones that we have in here, we have another Takeup. If you guys remember, there were the jargon episodes. Unfortunately, they got split in the links list. There's number 1 is episode 15. Episode 16 is number 2. A lot of folks really love those. Those dive pretty deep into typography, so they can help you to understand how type is put together, how letters, individual glyphs are put together. And I think that that really enriches your ability to take any lettering, whether it's hand lettering, whether it's, hey, brush painted lettering, any sort of normal font that we would exist or expect to exist in our canon. This will help you kind of understand how they're put together, and it might give you some ideas on how to discuss them. And honestly, if you hear me using a word that you don't know as far as talking about fonts, talking about letters and glyphs, that's going to be covered in both jargon 1 and 2. But we had a lot of fun talking about the different parts of the letter, kind of the nomenclature of the letter and how to put that together. So that was cool on episode 1 and 2. I thought I'd bring that in. Another couple of ones had a webinar with Madeira where I talked about small lettering and intricate detail. And I actually had Rich Medcraft, another great digitizer from Stitchwise Embroidery, who actually was in there with me with the Madeira folks. So Madeira USA hosted that. And we got to talk a lot about small lettering and about what we can achieve with 6-8 thread. And Rich also kicked in and he's done some incredible work. I will say he's done a lot more 6-8 work over the course of his career than I have, because he really started early. Whereas I'm going to tell you, in my shops, in the shops where I worked, particularly, a lot of the time we really didn't replace needles. We really didn't change thread thicknesses that much. And when I first started, there really weren't a lot of options there. So we really stuck with 40 weight. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. 40 weight, 7511 needle was really the order of the day. And in the case of trying not to stop production or trying not to do different setups, we really worked with how much we could push that 40 weight thread, how much we could push that 7511 needle. So that some of my assumptions and discussions about this are definitely based in the fact that for the nature of production, for the nature of the thread stock I had available when I started out, we really weren't looking to start doing thin threads, though I do very much recommend them now. Last couple of things here. If you guys hadn't seen before, I did my patch class recently, a couple of weeks ago, and that was a 4-hour class. People really enjoyed it who were there, learned a lot about making small run emblems at home, but everybody said, hey, when are we going to get the recording availability? The recording is out there now, so that is there at a reduced price for the recording without the live component. So if you want to see the recording, that is out there in the links. And one of the other pieces here, just to talk about kind of custom fonts for a second, for those of you who decide to get into digitizing your own custom fonts, a Graphics Pro article, pairing embroidery fonts with workwear, where I talk about selecting fonts and talking about the audience for the apparel you're decorating and the effect of the decoration as well. And certainly there's a little commentary there, and the image that's there is of some custom font work I did earlier on in my career. And that's something you'll hear from me repeatedly, that I think there is a place for digitizing your own custom fonts as part of digitizing an embroidery service. So there's all the stuff. Like I said, we've got some cool stuff we're going to go over. And certainly I will bring some of that stuff up as we get going through here. But yeah, as I said, have the articles, have the decorators community stuff. So you can definitely go get that recording if you want to, since I know that was asked more than a couple times. And there's that pairing embroidery fonts with workwear piece. So that's all on the links list today. Grab that from the link. I will go ahead and drop that in the comments here shortly, so you guys can grab that and click that for later. So if you're looking at this later, top comment or comment at this point, at least, we'll have that links list in it. So let me go ahead and grab a few comments before we get into the meat of the matter and discuss it. So let's go ahead and talk about whatever the comments we have and the questions. Like I said, I'm really happy to go ahead and derail the show for you if there's something you really need. So let's go ahead and start talking about that stuff. Yeah. By the way, Eric's TED Talk relating to the 4 hours of me talking on patches. Yes, that was long, but I wanted to give you the most value you could. Right now, if you go pay $79.99, you get $20 an hour. You get all the patch knowledge I can give you, or at least within that. All All right, so let's go ahead and grab a couple more people here. We've got Frank Dunn coming in from the UK. Good evening, all. Thank you for jumping in. And by the way, I don't know the price. AmuseFuse says, I like your cap, and then says, wish they had it, and how much did it cost? Not particularly a lot. Go to Sanmar, the usual place where I get a lot of my stuff, one of the great providers of garments in the decoration industry. And this cap, I believe, is still available. I haven't bought a new set for a while, but yeah, I'm fond of the military caps myself, guys. But what I will say is, hey, decoration is limited. If you're above the seam, you only have about an inch, so you have a very limited vertical palette for that decoration. What I'm going to say is definitely a reason for small text working on hats like that. So I'll have to tell you folks, that is one of those things that it is difficult to deal with sometimes if you get hats like this, and I love the flat caps. I'm thinking it's time for patches. And you guys know I've been making smaller end patches. This comes straight out of our Stitch Artist settings. And we were looking at this yesterday. I'm thinking, is it time for a patch, guys? Is it time to do the kind of beret style patch on the hat? I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it. All right, folks. So let's go ahead and go with a couple more comments before we get done. Guest is in. Happy to see you in from Sweden. Mike says, tiny text is a must master because it's always at the bottom of a logo, I'm going to guess. And they always want it on a hat. Little details, 1/2 inch off the brim, super fun. And that actually leads me into one of the points I want to make about small text. People will invariably take the time to tell you, hey, I can make 3mm, 4mm text all day long. The truth of the matter is you can make 3 and 4mm text all day long on a substrate that doesn't cause problems. If we're working on a structured hat, what we have to realize is not only are we dealing with a twill. Now, admittedly, structured hats and most hats are made out of a polyester twill, which is incredibly fine-grained. It doesn't have a lot of texture. It does have a kind of a diagonal rib to it. But the fact that it doesn't have a lot of texture means that it holds up to small stitching and detail pretty well. Except most structured hats are going to have some sort of buckram in them, some sort of hard plastic mesh layer. Generally, we call it a buckram. And there are other kinds of buckram and crinoline and other things that might be in different materials, but whatever. A buckram stiffening layer inside of the crown of that cap. Buckram can cause needles to deflect. Needles will track to either one side or the other of part of the weave, of the warp and the weft of buckram. And it's kind of an even woven material. And I've actually shown this in some of the cap episodes we've done. There are incredibly tough, incredibly stiff plastic meshes that are used. And pardon me for that, plastic meshes that are used inside of caps that will cause the needle to deflect. As it comes along the thread in the plastic mesh, the needle will want to go to one side or the other. And because it's even woven, it will also do it vertically sometimes. When we're dealing with that and we get into these sizes that 1/2 millimeter can cause trouble, one size or another of that mesh, if we can have a satin column and it looks pretty nice, but then it jukes in because we have that little deflection across that hard plastic material, it can cause our text quality to look rough. And there's no amount of underlay, there's no amount of work we can do at that scale that will stop, let's say, like a fine needle from deflecting. And people will recommend on some of these hats to use very thick needles. We'll use certainly titanium or reinforced needles, but they'll use really thick sharps and then want to do this really small movement. And you have to think about the width of your column. If the blade of your needle is as wide as that entire column, you can drop that needle right in the same hole over and over again because you're going to make a big hole. And when you don't move far enough away from that hole, there's nothing between it. There's no material between one needle penetration and the next on your satin stitch. You're not going to get a nice column. You'll have to have a wider satin stitch. And so really tiny, tiny text on caps is difficult, not just because your digitizing has problems. Let's just say, assume that your digitizing doesn't have problems. And it may be, if you have perfect digitizing, you could still be hitting that support material in such a way that you get needle deflection, that you get bad edge quality, or that it tracks a little bit on that needle deflection. It tracks on that weave. When that happens, you're going to have quality issues in your embroidery. The same thing happens with coarse materials. If you heard me talk about coarse materials before, it's something that I discussed once again in the patch world where people want to make a stiff patch and The erroneous belief is that if I get a coarsely woven material, like a cotton duck or something that's really heavy, really coarse, you will end up where you can get that kind of tracking. You can have that kind of needle deflection, sometimes even with a sharp, that will cause you to have stair-stepping, sawtoothing, and other edge quality problems. So part of the issue here is to realize what's possible for your substrate. The substrate is part of this. This is a holistic attempt. Whenever you see somebody sample out their tiny, tiny micro fonts, and I am as guilty of this as anybody, but if you see someone who's selling microfont products, they're usually sampled on polyester twill without support materials before it's put together. Why? Because it's incredibly fine. And if it doesn't have any sort of material that's going to cause the needle to track, then it's going to give you the best case scenario where the texture of the material is not interfering with the font. You go and put that on a knit that has ribs, you go and put that on something that has some texture, and you're likely to see a worse quality response at very small sizes. Especially, can you imagine this for a moment? We've got a polo shirt, we've got a sport shirt that has a basket weave, a piqué, some sort of texture to it, and the ribs on that, the pattern on that, these small divots that are in the basket weave or the piqué are wider than your satin stitch, then the satin stitches will drop right into them. Even with underlay, where we're trying to lift with our underlay, you may have some textural issues and you may have some edge quality issues. So it's worth understanding, especially if we try and drop all the underlay out, because it's another problem people have that where they will tend to say, all right, we're having issues with underlay. Let's say we're having some run out where underlay is getting outside of the edge of one of the columns, and they'll say, all right, drop all the underlay, don't use underlay at all. The problem with dropping all the underlay when we have that sort of issue is then when we are going over texture, let's say I have a very strong horizontal texture where I have some threads that are part of the material that are sticking proud of the element, or we have kind of gaps and divots. When we run our satin stitch on top, it's going to fall in and we're going to see the thread break through, and it's going to make the columns look broken and the edges look serrated. So when we have underlay underneath it, we can hold up that satin stitch away from that background. And certainly we're going to want to use toppings and things like that. That is a good case for a water soluble topping to hold up the thread on top of that material. Not everybody likes to use them, but that is a really good case for them when we have texture. But I would say even with, and this is something, I'm going to go ahead and bring in Mike Muldowney's comment because he's absolutely right. Even with smooth polos, using woven backing, the slight deflections can cause issues. Smooth polos, it doesn't matter that you're smooth on top if the needle is tracking something on the bottom. That's really the case. And that's the same thing with the hats. So I'll go ahead and grab a couple more comments here because I do have some other questions. Like I said, I have some other stuff I'd like to talk about, but I want to talk about a couple of the other comments here. Christine says this, and I actually want to discuss this. Comment on the 60 weight versus 40 weight question. I heard that you don't need 60 weight if your lettering is digitized accurately. Accordingly, is this true? Not necessarily. Here's the thing. We know 60 weight is thinner. 60 weight is approximately, and this is, approximate. The way it behaves is that as if it is approximately 25% thinner than a 40 weight thread. And you can usually get a reliable finish on something that is about 1/4 smaller in the same way than you could on, say, 40 weight thread. You can very reliably get 4 and sub 4 millimeter letters out of 60 weight thread because we've got that smaller thread. We've got that smaller ability to hold up as well. The columns can be a little thinner. The satins will hold up. The gaps will hold up, particularly if you're using a smaller needle. Now, I'm going to tell you, can you use a 7511 needle and get okay results? You can. Better to have a 65.9? Absolutely it is. The smaller holes we're going to leave are going to be easier to keep us from doing that thing where we're dropping into the same hole. Can you get results? You can, but this is a holistic process. It's all about the texture of the garment or the substrate you're stitching on. Also, like I said, the texture, the weave, the coarseness, whatever support materials you're using underneath it, and the needle will also affect the outcome. However, this is the thing. It's not about digitized correctly or not correctly. If it's accordingly, you can get small text out of a 40 weight thread. The safe limit I always call 5 millimeters. And actually, I'll bring the graphic up. This is something we've discussed many, many times. It's not like you haven't seen me do this entire rigmarole about my 5 millimeter. In fact, I think I probably did it last week as well. But for those of you who have missed this speech, I will give you the speech again. Why is 5mm height on most fonts what I consider the safe minimum for 40 weight thread? And that's because we essentially have this stack of the minimum sized satin stitches that will hold up reliably on most materials, and the minimum sized gaps that will stay open and look clean on most materials. And they're very similar. It is about 1mm for a satin stitch to hold up reliably and not want to sink in or disappear or get too thin on most materials. And the gap is 0.8mm to 1mm on most materials for it to completely look open, to have some, to have what I always say, some daylight showing through it, to see the background, to see the substrate, and have it not either jump across or pull holes, things like that. With that being the case, 40 weight thread, we're going to have that stack. As you can see here, we've got satin, gap, satin, gap, satin, the lowercase e. Why do I put the lowercase here? Because we can't have 5mm uppercase and then expect a lowercase that's down at 3mm to run correctly on that 40 weight thread. So this is 40 weight thread, 7511 needle. All day long, you can get a 5mm letter out of it pretty reliably. But like I show in lots of different examples, and in fact, one of the ones that's on this article, this is the example of the Karen Kuhn photography piece. And this was done, as you can see, 40 weight thread, 7511 needle on a structured hat. However, as you can see, though some of the letters are under 5mm, what letters are they? Letters like the O and the G, they only have a 3 stack. If you think about it, you have a satin, you have a gap, you have a satin. That means that on a 40 weight thread, 7511 needle, I should be able to go down close to 3mm on that and still have it run legibly under those assumptions. The assumptions that we're only going to get down to about 1mm of width in a satin, and we can only get a gap that is clean at about 0.8mm. And I would say those have served me very well as safe limits. Can you get smaller with 40 weight thread? 100% you can. When you do, you're usually having to make a lot of concessions to make that happen. You're not getting whatever text you want, whatever style you want, whatever font you want, whatever the customer asks for. Now this one, here we are, custom tattoo style font taken out of it was actually done off of an oil painting, the original art. So this is hand lettering. It is a custom style font. We did manage to maintain most of the quality of that font on this hat. Now, there are some edge quality issues. There's a little bit of roughness, but I'm going to say, if you're looking at that ruler here, well, there's 5 and we're under 5. We're at 4.5 all the way across, and some of the letters are 3 and below. This is absolutely there. But at this size, when we back up from it, you guys have heard me say many times to think about the handshake distance, that 3 foot minimum that we're viewing things at if they're on a human being. The choice that we have here is to make it look good from that distance. If we want to zoom in on this thing and look at it under a magnifying glass, of course, there's going to be some edge issues. So as far as what Christine said, commenting on 60 weight versus 40 weight, sometimes people use 60 weight thread as a fix for things that were digitized for 40 weight thread, but done so with too much density. That's one thing. Somebody will digitize with too much density, trying to alleviate things like that sawtoothing on the edge. They're going to just jam more thread into it. Say, if I put more points along that edge, for sure it's going to be smoother. Yes, that may be the case, but that means it's going to be too dense. It might be lumpy. It might break thread, things like that. And sometimes people will then substitute a 60 weight where it doesn't really need to be there, because the real problem is the density, not the digitizing of the shape, at least, or the size necessarily. So when people do that, then you could say, yeah, we can use 40 weight instead if the densities are right. And certainly I would say 60 weight thread shouldn't be used as just a drop in. It doesn't just drop in and fix other lettering necessarily. What it does do is, because it's 25% thinner, if you are running too dense, then it drops your density by that 25% just by swapping that out. So you can get some improvements there. When you digitize for 60 weight though, it enables you to do things that you can't do with 40 weight thread. You can't go that small very easily, or at least when you do, you're making a lot of concessions and it looks rougher. You're also getting a smoother edge because you're just dropping more penetration points in there. You have more threads defining that area. In fact, that's why you will see sometimes commercial patch companies doing their entire patches in 60 weight thread, because it looks incredibly fine. Looks very, very fine. So that's one of those things. I think that the utility of 60 weight thread is undeniable. The desire to work in 40 weight only, I fully understand. And in fact, this is what I'll bring up Cindy's comment on this. And this is actually the kind of old school way I was taught to do it. I sure don't want to have to buy another weight of thread for tiny text, so mine better work with my regular threads. Certainly. And that's what I'll say. Working with the 40 weight thread, if you understand the way it works, and honestly, what I just told you about the satin widths and the gaps is the best rule of thumb you can bring to this party, is to say, all right, I know I can make a satin stitch that is 1 millimeter wide. I mean, a little bit of compensation surely wouldn't hurt, but if it's 1 millimeter, it'll probably run. I can make a gap that's 0.8 to 1 millimeters, and that'll probably stay open. And from that, I can build any font, any lettering I need to, as long as I maintain those rules as my rule of thumb. As long as I keep the gaps open, as long as I keep the satin stitches to that minimum width, that minimum thickness, they will hold up decently. Certainly, we can talk about underlay in this. I have done a lot of manual underlay, but most of the time, as long as you've got underlay that is not too short, not too close to an edge, and generally, I like to use a connected underlay if I'm doing it manually, where I'm connecting the entire letter and running back, as long as I'm not building up too much travel in a complicated letter, then that helps. Certainly underlay helps. Certainly support materials like topping help. But if you think about those rules, you usually do all right. You usually do all right. And actually, we'll talk about more things in that vein. But I think the truth of the matter is 60 weight should be seen as a way to expand your abilities, not as necessarily the end-all answer to all small text. In fact, what I would say is a lot of your small text problems are due to the design being poor. Many times we want to actually increase the size of things. I mean, that's really what we want to do, because the truth of the matter is, if the material is being used for promotional products, if it's being used for uniforming, if it's being used for anything of that nature, the truth of the matter is we want it to be visible. We want it to be legible. And if it's not legible, well, there's really no point to it as a uniform, as something that's being used for promotions, unless it's part of a seal or something historical where it just needs to be there. They want it to be present. That's one reason why we might do that. Otherwise, the truth of the matter is you really don't necessarily want to have these really tiny threads, this really tiny text, just for the sake of doing it. If we think about the eventual audience, if we think about who's going to be looking at the final piece, well, if we're looking at that final piece, we want to say to ourselves, all right, is it doing the job it's supposed to do? Is it doing the job that we need it to? Is it legible from the distance where somebody will view it? If it's not, and that is important to the customer, if it's important for them to read that text, and I mean the end viewer, like if I'm selling it to a company who's putting it on their people, and their people are taking this uniform out into the world, their end customer, your customer's customer, if they need to read something legibly, we need to make sure that it can be read from 3 feet anyway. So sometimes we do this because we're patting ourselves on the back for the ability to make super tiny text. Sometimes it makes sense. Like I said, badges, patches, things like this, where I have to put something, I need this identifying information, and it has to go inside of a border, and that is a fixed size, and the patch itself is a fixed size. That is a super great reason for microfonts. That's a super great reason for small text. Throwing someone's entire division, name, city, state, phone number, and address on their left chest, that's a super poor reason for tiny text. So yes, part of it's the reason, part of it's that. So let me go ahead and let's bring in some other comments too, folks. I know there's a lot of people who are here, but I want to bring some other comments in and discuss this stuff and see what we feel about it. But certainly, Carol brings up a point that I'll understand. Certainly, we're talking about the fact that things like, this is when we were talking about the caps and the buckram tearing up small text. If you tell the customer that, doesn't it just sound like an excuse? They've seen it done before. How do you deal with that? Partially by showing them actual samples and showing them the inside of the hat if they have that problem. Also, if they're seeing it on a commercial hat, it's often done as a panel program. They're stitching the twill before they construct the hat. The ultimate end answer is, if you're not going to be able to do it on your machine, on the materials that they've asked for, on the hat they asked for, whether or not it sounds like an excuse, if it's not going to be feasible, then honestly, it doesn't matter if it sounds like an excuse or not. You'll have to deal with the customer not being able to get that answer. I understand that may not be what everybody likes to hear about it, but it's absolutely the case. if you cannot get it to reliably stitch on a finished hat, and that is one of the things to make clear to people, finished hats are very different from working on panels. If you can't get it to stitch on a finished hat, there is no reason to fight with the customer over it. We just tell them what's possible and what's not possible for the way that they're stitching it. I would explain panel programs to someone. But the other problem is if you have a customer who's going to look at something that is, 4 millimeters and get angry with you that it's not 3, you're probably cruising for trouble anyway. And it's a good time to talk to them about what reasonable things are to expect and a handshake distance. Rather than going to, in fact, I would start there sometimes. I would start there and say, this is not going to work out. Why don't we do something that will work out for what you want it to look like, for what people need to use? And I think that's really important anyway. But let me go ahead and grab a couple more comments here too. Mike asks, do you find push and pull on the sentence to be more or less pronounced at the tiny text size? 100% it's more pronounced. Because if we're thinking about it, the push and pull, the forces that are making the push and pull happen, whether it's the tension on the thread itself on each individual stitch, or it's the stacking up of stitches that make it push, or the sequence that makes it push, those forces haven't changed much. But when the size does, the percentage of the column that is changing is more. If we have a, and yes, there is differences in how long the stitch is and how much pull you're getting, for sure. But let's say that those are negligible. If we have a, 4 millimeter wide satin stitch and it's pulling in 0.2 mils on either side, well, it loses 0.4, that's 10%. If we have a 1 millimeter satin stitch and it's 0.4, it's 40%. It's 40% of the total width of the intended satin stitch. So absolutely, push and pull are going to look much more pronounced. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead because we're having these questions. I love that we're just openly talking about this stuff and having these questions. But let's go ahead and show you something. It's not my best example ever, but I'm going to show you, sadly, it's a reject sample that I have of this piece, but I'm going to show you a piece where we can really dig into that. The fact that this sort of distortion looks crazy when we get to super small sizes. And this is actually me breaking the safe rule. So we're going to actually pop this open. And this is, like I said, this is going to look rough. This piece, NQT 400, is a piece I did many, many years ago. In fact, what I'll do first, I'm going to bring up the Takeup banner from today so you can see it. If you look on the bottom of the actual thumbnail here, you'll see the original art on the left-hand side. You'll see right in the middle that there was an edited art where I did a little work on the borders and all these shadows and boundaries to kind of show them what was more possible for their size. And on the right is the preview, and you'll see the sample. I'll actually show you all some of that stuff again at least, but I just wanted to show you the original art on that thumbnail so you can see what I was talking about. But this is the thing. We're looking at 40 weight thread, 7511 needle, and we're looking at 3 millimeter text. And I'm going to tell you from a distance, not up close, because up close it doesn't look so great. And by the way, I'm going to tell you there's things I would change about this. Absolutely. Looking at this piece now, I would do it different. Absolutely. This is from years ago, but I had this sample around. It was something I was discussing, so it came to me to kind of show it today. Suffice it to say, 3 millimeter text, 40 weight thread, a 7511 needle. Is it possible? Yes. Yes, it's possible. First things I'm going to say about it. I'm running over a fill, and you can see how distorted this looks. This looks like it's not going to run. This looks like it's not going to run at all. I mean, let me zoom in on that and you can see it. It looks like it's not going to run. It looks like dog food. It looks horrible, right? This thing is destroyed. It does not look like it's going to run. It doesn't look like it should be okay. And I will grant you that. It looks rough. And when we're looking at this piece, we can see that we've got just everything is down to the absolute nth degree. We are on the smallest gap, sometimes no gap, and I'm relying on the pull to pull a gap open and to pull open the spacing on this lettering. And what you're going to say is there's no way this turned out. But what I'm going to say is with the restrictions that I put myself under on this piece, yes, it did. And here's what the sample looks like. And it doesn't look great. No, and this is a reject sample. This is one that actually was previous to doing some edits on it. However, you're looking at my thumb, and yes, I have a giant thumb, but the truth of the matter is here is this lettering that is some of it is sub 3 mils. It's right around that line, and it is legible. And if you pull back away from this thing, and in fact, I can simulate that. We'll just shrink that screen up. Yes, you can read it. You can read that top word, requirements. You can read verification on the bottom. You can read planning. Does it look awesome? No. This was me doing the thing I said not to do. This is me showing off, I guess, or at least this is me forcing the thread, forcing the design to do something it probably shouldn't do for a client. I did this many, many years ago. If I were doing this again today, I would I would examine doing 60-weight thread, because yes, we had the discussion. Cindy said you don't want to have another weight of thread. The thing is, most of your lettering is going to be in a smaller range of colors than you have for other things. Keeping 60-weight black, white, red, gold for this state at least, because those are some colors we used quite a bit. Maybe navy. Keeping a small stock of 60-weight thread might be worthwhile, because a lot of your text is going to be done in the same colors, or at least you could offer it in those colors or offer a color change to do the teeny tiny text. However, can you make it run? Can you force it? Yes. When you do, you're having to make concessions. What you're going to see is, I changed the lettering from the original lettering that was there. We now have a lettering that is a simplified version of itself. It is not exactly the lettering that was there. It is definitely a sans serif. It is a compressed font. So it is tall, so that I'm using the verticality of the font to get more space on the gaps in the letters. So I am using the best case scenario. This is sans serif. This is all caps. It is compressed. I have stretched it. It is also stretched to the utmost before I start getting too close to the edges of those little arrows. The fill stitches behind it, I'm using a curved fill, not for the look necessarily, but because I wanted to control the angle at which the underlying fill was interacting with the overlying satins. So I'm doing a lot of control. And the truth of the matter is, I don't think that that is necessarily the best way to make money. Yes, is it possible? Is it the way I would have done it now? No. Because I think it would have been better served a different way. Now, this is the other thing too. It's on top of fill. I'm not running on top of a polo shirt. I am constructing my own background for this. Because it's running on top of fill, I am making a background that runs. And I haven't painted this out, edited this, messed with it, trimmed it, colored it with a marker. As you can see, there are trims visible on this piece. This is a rough, off-the-machine sample, and it's certainly not perfect. But what it is legible, and especially at a distance, it looks pretty clean for what we've done with that 40-weight thread. What I'm going to say is it's not the way to handle it best. It's not the way to handle it best, and I wouldn't recommend you do it. And what you can see is, this is part of the things that got edited. In reevaluate here, though you can usually count on the push on the bottom legs of an A to pop the little tiny legs out so you have tiny feet on the A underneath the crossbar, on this particular A in here, worked down in the red, that one actually has legs. You can see that there are some semblance of legs down in this A, but up in the middle A on reevaluate, it didn't work and had to be edited where it did here. And that's to the point of literally interacting incorrectly with that fill underneath it would be enough to cause that problem at this size. The smaller you go, the more pronounced your distortion looks in your file, and the more you're going to run into difficulty with any kind of texture, with any kind of problem on your machine, with any kind of problem with the stabilizer, with any shifting, with any texture of any kind, with interactions with the angle of the fill behind it. The smaller we get, the less slop we have, the less ability to let things run as they should run that we have. If we let things run like this, the chances are we have more chance of spoilage, more chance of ruining a garment. It's why I tend to fight for not doing it at all. It's not that it's bad, but yes, absolutely one of those things. So, I mean, it's not something to feel bad about if you don't try and do that. In fact, I think the best thing you can do is to probably omit small text that can't be read from the handshake distance. Omit it or make it larger. That is what I teach. That's what I tell people to try to do. Carol says, how do you digitize for 60-weight thread? How does it look different on the screen? How do you adjust the image size? Do I adjust the image size? Well, how do we digitize differently for 60-weight thread? We're going to want to increase our density, usually by 25%. And how does it look different on screen? It looks like you saw. It looks much more compensated usually. Depends on the size you're doing. If you're very, very small, you're under 3 millimeters like that, gonna look crazy. 60-weight thread, though, the other thing is that generally software is not going to show the thread as any thicker in the preview. That may cause it to be a little harder to look at in your preview. Depends Depends on your software. Depends on how that works. Generally, they're not going to show 60 weight as thinner than the 40 weight thread. So you just have to know this is one of those times where sampling is going to be your friend. Do I adjust the image size? I adjust it. Depends on what I'm working on. I adjust it as I would adjust any art to the image, to the size that I'm trying to do at the resolution I want. So yeah. Cindy says about toppings. We were talking about water soluble films, things like that. I was taught topping on piqué fabrics. Not that I do much cotton piqué anymore. Yeah, it's not as popular as it used to be by far, but anything that has texture on it like that, I used to use topping on those. What I'm going to say is people will tend to say they don't like to remove it because they don't want to wash it out. If you steam the sheet and roll it across, I used to roll it it looks like a big cigarette rolling across the top of it, or a big wad. Some people make a ball. I think by the time you've made a ball, you're already doing more work than you need to. I used to literally run a Jiffy garment steamer up and down the thing as it rolled up the sheet. I would roll it across it as it was malleable, and it would pull out all the little pieces. So if you do that technique, it's not that hard to remove, even from the centers of small lettering. And I never washed garments fully to get it out. So it's one of those things. Okay, Mike says, and I agree with this one as well. I love how small text relies somewhat on the brain of the reader to recognize letters and words that may not actually be fully formed. To a degree, people will analyze things in that way. And if it's small enough that it's not really all that legible, they're going to make assumptions about it anyway. In that case, we just want to get as clean as we can. So I think that's the thing. We're trying to get as clean as we can, but we know, especially like we talked about the small detail, when we talked about dealing with other kinds of issues, you're trying to intimate what is there. You don't have to reproduce every little line. It doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, this is fabric. This is thread. This is something that has a lot of fuzz to it, literally and figuratively. This is something that doesn't necessarily have to be knife edge perfect all the time. Certainly, we're going to have clients who want things to be that perfect, who want it to look like it's liquid thread, like it's printed. The truth of the matter is that we're going to have to be clear about that. And I think one of the best things we can do is to show them samples, our own stitch samples, not their logo. We're not spending money on doing their logo every time they do it. Make ourselves a set of samples of lettering at different sizes on common material if we want to go that far, and show them what it looks like and say, once we get under this size, like talk to them about their art. Remember, consultation, not commodity. We want to be consultants. We want to be solutions people. We don't want to be the machine someone puts money in and garments come out. Because we can't add enough value that way. We can as consultants. So we talk to them and say, hey, here we are. This is what it looks like. If you're bringing me this art and we have text of this size and you want me to maintain this size and this aspect ratio on the garment, particularly on this garment with this texture, you're going to get these kind of results. I'm happy to make that for you if it's something that's possible, but I'm warning you now, or at least I'm informing you now, that if we get too small on certain kinds of material, with certain color combinations, sometimes we're going to see this quality. And if we show them that quality ahead of time, if we make it clear that we're communicating this and having it clear out in the open, shown in a sample in the thread, or at least in a photograph of a sample, we can be clear with them about what they can expect. And clearing up expectations is a big deal. It's a super big deal. And yeah, Mike says, I say bye-bye to serifs all the time for small stuff. Yeah. Often you do. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of ways you can handle that and how you can make selections that make it easier to deal with serifs or to keep serifs. But the truth of the matter is many times you have to get rid of serifs, especially if we're talking about lettering where the serif is separate. If we have serifs that are broken from the main line and they say run in a perpendicular angle, those are difficult because the height of the serif then has to be that 1 millimeter if it's a satin stitch serif, and we're having that perpendicular vertical serif stitch angle versus like the horizontal stroke that's attached to. So that's a big deal. And actually, I'm going to bring Mike's comment in here. By the way, thank you guys for commenting and reacting, because I think that we have a more lively discussion like this. And that way, when I do this the third, fourth, fifth time, we have new voices coming up to bring things up. And I love that. Machine speed, I find, is a big factor in small text quality. Also, slow and steady and leave the jump stitches in. Yeah. Leave connectors in or run small connectors or nesting runs. I know in Brilliance, we have the ability to run when jumps are small. We can drop a stitch in between, just one stitch between two letters. And if we're on something that has any sort of thickness to it, any sort of body to it, you can actually sink a stitch between it. If you're light colored on top of a dark garment, it may or may not look super clean, but I don't like tie-offs. Tie-offs and tie-ons inside of words, they have a tendency to break up the ends. And no matter how well you do them, they have a tendency to break up the ends of the column and cause a little bit of texture there that you may or may not like. So letting there be connectors, especially when we're this small and the spacing between the letters is so small, connecting between them is a great plan. I think it is, at least. And that's something I would prefer to do. I rather would not trim between each little one, because that usually means we have to have a tie. Now, I'm going to say this with caution. Really small lettering has a tendency not to pull out as much as large lettering when we don't put in specific ties. Being that, if you think about what a tie-off is, it's a series of 3 or 4 very small stitches that are looped back into the column. Well, on small lettering, you may find those small stitches don't want to unhinge or come apart and fray the same way that you do on large lettering. Am I telling you to take those out? No, I wouldn't. What I'm going to say is that they will hold in better than, say, a giant 7mm wide column stitch. That's going to be a different thing. 7mm satin is going to try and pull over. And Mike says, I'm not trying to take over, honest. Keep taking over, Mike. He's reciprocator number 1 for a reason. Thank you for jumping in and talking about it. We've all dealt with tiny text. If we have something to say about it, I want to hear about it. And you guys are absolutely in on it. And Mike, for sure. And like I said, okay, Cindy, oh, great. You're making me feel guilty for not having 68 thread. No, don't feel guilty. I'm here to tell you that most of the pieces you've seen from me that I did for my shop, almost all of them were 40 weight thread. Number 1, because I'm going to tell you to make something legible at the handshake distance, I don't need to go that small. I don't need to go that small, because I can go down to 5mm and we're good. Number 2, because we didn't switch the thread out and the needles out unless we absolutely had to for a customer. Did we do it? Absolutely. In fact, I'll bring back up the banner that I had up. Here's the thumbnail one more time. And if you see up on the upper right-hand side, that is the Boba Tea Company. That particular piece was run in 68 thread because they demanded these incredibly fine lines. And by the time we got done working on it, as you can see right next there, that is a USB plug, a standard USB plug on the right-hand side for scale. And what looks like it's on a sweater is on a standard knit shirt. This thing is like a jersey knit shirt. It looks like a t-shirt as far as the texture when you're not zoomed in. They wanted very, very small lettering that looked clean. And in order to get it, I had to use toppings. So I had to use a water-soluble film, and I had to use 68 thread to do it. However, look over at Karen Kuhn on the left-hand side, 40 weight thread. Look at the NQT piece, admittedly from earlier on in my career, 40 weight thread. Most of the time we ran 40 weight thread. You shouldn't feel guilty about it. It's about understanding the variables and then making your decisions from there, right? It's about understanding the variables and making your decisions based on that. Now, I would like to talk about some other things related to this stuff. Invariably, when we're talking about this stuff, it's not necessary for us to go over everything again, but I'm going to make this comment again. Safe sizes work. This is from an old webinar I did. So you're seeing branding and stuff from an old webinar series. Ignore that. But the thing is, this is one that somebody brought up to me when I was having this discussion this week. And when I realized this is something I could show you guys, I thought, hey, I'll bring this back up. But safe sizes are what we're talking about. When I talk about that 5mm, it's a safe size. It's not that you can't go smaller. It's that at that size, your preview looks pretty normal to the customer and to yourself. It's not crazy distorted. It's easy enough to read and to show your previews. Otherwise, I've had to make specific previews for customers. And by the way, I'll tell you how I did that. I would take my design and take all of the comp off and then save my high resolution 3D graphic from that. The 3D preview graphic was saved with all of the pull and push, the pull compensation off. The push compensation is digitized in because especially at the time, I didn't have a software that had push compensation as any sort of setting. I was just digitizing that in myself. So I was stopping my columns a little early. As you know, at the open ends of the satin stitch, I was stopping those before I hit where I wanted them to eventually land. So I couldn't take all the distortion out, but if I took all of the pull comp off, it makes the lettering look legible enough for the customer to get the size again. The truth of the matter is, though, when we get to really small sizes and we're doing all this crazy distortion, you may not be able to make a digital preview that's really accurate, and you're going to have to tell the customer, at these sizes, we're going to have to sample, and if you're someone who charges for samples, you need to make that clear to the customer and say, until I have that sample, you're not really going to see it. Because as we all know, the file isn't the product, the embroidery is the product. Well, in this case, safe sizes, most of the time they still look okay, and it's not crazy. However, the thing is, yes, they're safe sizes. They just work most of the time. Custom fonts are possible. Like I said, if you understand these measurements, if you know your rules of thumb, you measure, you adjust, you repeat as needed. That's how that works. And here's the other thing I wanted to show you is some best kinds of selections when we're talking about keyboard lettering too. Because everybody says, how do I do this in keyboard lettering if I'm not digitizing, I'm not doing all this crazy tweaking? Well, like I said before, open sans serif fonts, big flare serif fonts that have really nice open counters in them. And then here's the other one I wanted to discuss one more time is the idea of serifs. We talked about breaking up serifs. If you must have a serif, what I'm going to say, I call them this. This is what I call them. It's not what everybody calls them. I call them in-column serifs. What I mean is that the serif is just a widened satin that is in the same angle as the stroke. And I don't think you can see it as well here, and I'll probably show you a different example here. But on the left-hand side, and this is an old slide that I had, you can see how we have the cut here, and that this serif on this side, on the left-hand side, the serif has a vertical stitch angle, and then it turns into the corner, and we have a horizontal angle on the main spine of the letter. Whereas if you look at this is on the right-hand side is a Times that was digitized for small fonts. It's not a perfectly digitized one. I think that there is better to be done on this. However, what you can see is the serifs are just a widening or a flaring of the main column. You can also do this in a block style as well. And in fact, if I go back to the article I've got from Images here, if I go back to the Easy as ABC article, we can actually take a look at this on a more sized up variant. Now, it's also because I'm showing you guys an error that you can make if you start scaling letters up, but this still is good to show you what we're talking about. On the right-hand side is a piece digitized for standard kind of medium sizes. We've got serifs that are run separate. So the top of the bar, the serifs are separate. We have a vertical roughly stitch angle here. We have a horizontal stitch angle for the spine. On the left-hand side is an in-column set of serifs. So this is a slab serif font. These are very similar fonts. However, this one was made for smaller sizes. And as such, this angle of the serif is the same as the angle of the spine. What you can see down here, though, the reason I call this out is if we're using this for a large scalable representation, this is going to eventually get really big. Once this gets over 12 millimeters, let's say we start trying to scale this whole thing up, you're going to have all these jumps or stitches that can't run whatsoever, or that do the really loud ka-chunk double stroke kind of thing that we all have talked about before with these extremely long stitches that are pushing what the machine is capable of doing. So at large sizes, they don't work. However, when we're trying to run really small sizes and maintain the serifs, what we can do is use these in-column serifs that match that same angle. They're more likely to run because we're not dealing with the width of that satin getting too small. Because as you can see from that other piece, and I'll bring that back up again for you, you can have a serif be a couple of lines of thread. You can have it literally be a single stitch out. Now that I think looks a little too rough. You probably want a median stitch in between because you're going to have some spacing between those on the edge. But you can have a couple of stitches be a serif, a very fine serif, if it's an in-column serif. Personally, don't love the look. My choice is go for some nice big blocks. Go for something that has something like that. Or I am a big fan, and this is why I added my own version of a font called Albertus in TrueType fonts. It's a Roman font, or Trajan is similar but not the same. Albertus is this kind of flare serif font, and we actually have flare serif in Stitch Artist that I added and recreated with some new stock and did some different letter forms than the standard stuff you'll see out there. But I did it in this same model of a flared serif because you get a little bit of a serif, but you never have this one unsupported stitch that might track one side or the other of something. You have a nice gradual flare. It still has kind of the feeling of a serif, but it is thicker. It runs better. We don't have these little tiny single threads that can track left or right or have distortion break them up. But what you can see is big open counters, big open spaces as best you can. The other thing I will tell you, though, is you have to realize that when we have push and pull, one of the problems we can have at really small text, if we have little apertures here, you know, this is called the aperture, this opening here in the S, where this S comes down, we really probably should cut this back, cut the top stroke back, or tilt it back out of the way, because as we can see, that open end is going to want to go down toward the rest of the S. It's going to want to try and push toward the existing central spine of the S on both sides. When it does so, especially when we're in incredibly small sizes, this S in comparison to this one, this S especially is going to want to turn into an 8. because it's going to want to crash into that center satin. Now, this has a pretty decently sized gap, but as we get smaller and smaller and smaller, you may find yourself making alterations to make that stuff stay open. So it really depends on where you're working. And like I said, there's lots of things we do, and things sometimes look crazy, like dropping a crossbar in the A, as you can see, might look crazy at this size, but when we get really small, the one that looks bad is the normal A that doesn't have the dropped crossbar. We know that we have these little legs that will lengthen down here. If we get super small, we can have issues with that. But the truth of the matter is, usually you can almost be flush with this crossbar and have it still, the legs will push out as long as they are, of course, if they're flush, the crossbar is going to shrink a little bit from pull comp. The ends of the legs are going to push out just a little bit from push distortion. And we're going to get a little hint of legs on the A when we're dealing with small apertures in the A. We're dealing with really small lettering. So the other things we can do, and this is something that, like I said, I don't do this all the time. You have to be in incredibly small areas where I'm going to do this, incredibly small micro fonts. You can replace your crossbars with a manual stitch. I don't always love the look of this, but what I will say is when you get down to extremely small sizes, this is sometimes the only way to get a crossbar in A to look great, because we have this small triangular opening. But this is incredibly small sizes, because you have to realize if we have like a 1.2 millimeter wide stitch here and you only go over and across, that's only going to be 0.4 millimeters thick. We're going to have an incredibly big difference between the thickness of the stroke and the rest of this crossbar. It's going to be much different in thickness. But when we get small enough that they're close, or if we run maybe a couple stitches across and back and build up the width, then we can end up with a stroke width that's not too crazy. We get really, really small, though. Sometimes it is worthwhile for us to do this with a crossbar because we just want it to be legible. And even if there's a little bit of strangeness between the thickness of the A crossbar and the sides, the legs, that it's not so strange that we aren't willing to put up with it in order to get an openness to it so it doesn't just look like a filled triangle. So it's the same thing when we're talking about editing in keyword lettering as digitizing our own custom lettering. We want to look for where apertures are small. We want to look for these hooks that are going to push up, these loops and hooks that are going to push up into the body of the letter. Open up your apertures, drop your crossbars, let the legs be a little shorter because they're going to lengthen from push. Pull back on the hooks, drop the hooks on things like G's. Try and leave some daylight. Open up the bowl, drop or shorten the hook. Drop your central crossbars where you can, because what we're trying to do is get to those safe limits. If we're on 40 weight thread, that means we're trying to get to that 0.8 millimeter gap in here to 1 point. We're trying to get our stitch, our satin widths to 1 millimeter if we can. If we're on 60 weight thread, we can go down by 25%. We can get down to, easily down to that 4 and sub 4 millimeter lettering. If we're on good textures, that will support it. But when we do that, we have to look at the shapes that we're creating and think about the stressors we're putting them under. Think about the push, think about the pull, and also remember that we're driving a needle sometimes tens and tens of times along the edge of this counter. If you keep dropping a needle in the same hole too close to itself, you're also going to make an eyelet. You're going to bore a hole in your material against your own better judgment if you don't have a little bit more openness, if you don't allow there to be some space there. So that's one of those things, right? And thin thread, we talked about it, 25% smaller. So like I said, you can get your text down to 3.7 mils. I like to stay at 4 because I think it's a nice, safer round, but I also like to run a thinner needle. Can you use 7511s? Yes, but once again, we're getting closer to that boring problem. We're getting closer to that eyelet problem the more we're using that. And same thing with script fonts. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's one more thing I want to show you. You can see that sometimes the generic script font you have, it's the shapes that are causing you the problem, and it doesn't have to change much. It looks like I'm changing it quite a bit when we look at it at a larger size, but at a small size, it still reads as a brush script font. Classic Brush is one of those ones that often looks kind of poor. It's why I'm going to be creating one of my own at some point where I actually do some of these edits ahead of time. They have an extreme lean. They're very oblique. They lean to the right pretty extremely. And in doing that, we're closing up our counters a little bit. So I like to reduce the skew angle on those. I like to open up the counters. You can see in the E that I've dropped this counter open, especially at the smallest sizes. I've dropped it quite a bit open. Though this looks a little weird zoomed in, as you can see, when it's small, we go from having no counter, cutting a buttonhole in our garment, up to having enough daylight, as I always say, having enough of that material there that we can actually get a hole that's visible. So it's the same kind of thing we're doing no matter how we're addressing small text. We're trying to find a way to get these things safer. We're trying to find a way to make sense of them. And I think that the way we do it is by understanding kind of, I would say, the rules of thumb, understanding those minimums, understanding what's possible physically, and then playing to it, because we can stretch those rules. We can absolutely stretch those rules. We can be within a little bit of a variation from them. And if we're on ideal materials, if we have other things that are running to our favor, like incredibly smooth materials, something that doesn't distort very much, if we are able to run the proper needles, if we're able to slow our machines down, we can get a better quality output from it. And maybe we can actually stretch what we're doing. 5mm rule for 40-weight thread, that is my safe rule for most people running at the usual speed that runs well for their machine without too much hassle on medium difficult, if you want to call it, medium difficulty materials that hold up pretty well to stitching. So let me go ahead and grab a couple comments here as well. So we'll have to see with that. Aaron says, I'm okay with my size. But I keep telling myself when I'm in doubt. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, when we're running really small lettering, the other thing that can happen is we'll start to get that ultra zoom mentality. We'll keep on holding the thing right up to our face. We'll grab our piece and we'll hold it up to one eye and close one eye and stare at it and start really tearing it up and looking at it in a way that a customer won't. And in a way that you probably shouldn't let them judge it. Honestly, once you've discussed with them the difficulties of what they're doing, especially if it's on something difficult, if someone brings you in super heavy cotton duck or duck cloth Carhartt jackets, and then they want 3mm text directly on it, it's a good time to talk to them about the possibilities of patches or something else, using some other substrate to make it look better. If they're desperate to have the tiny text, then you find a way to make the tiny text work, and you explain to them why and why not, what works and what doesn't. I think that really works. Certainly, it's there is room to say that you can go to that point of just saying, I won't do anything under a certain size because it's just easy and I don't want to mess with it. There is something to that. Surely, I think everybody should try and run some small lettering. You should find a micro font set that works for you if you just have to use them on occasion or on more than occasional usage where it makes sense for you to have some micro fonts that work well. Find some keyboard fonts that shrink down to small sizes and run cleanly for you. And I think that's useful. It is something customers will ask for. However, you are going to be more likely to ruin garments the smaller you get. And I think a lot of customers, if you discuss with them the use case, they are going to understand it, especially when we start talking about things that are promotional. If it's not just someone making something themselves, I mean, some of the smallest stuff I've done was for bridal, and it was like quotes on handkerchiefs. And by the way, there is nothing to make you sweat like running incredibly small, fully dense lettering on an heirloom handkerchief that feels like it's going to tear apart at any time. Fuse that stuff to something if you can. Find some other way. Buy them a handkerchief and swear up and down that you don't want to run on the heirloom, because that is not fun. Did I do it anyway? Yes, it did. So teeny tiny text on those things, that can be difficult. It wasn't texturally difficult, but we know we're putting a lot of punctures in it. We are definitely driving a needle through it several times. We're having a lot of material on it, and it can cause issues anyway. It can cause issues with the material. Like I said, you can get the whole buttonhole, eyelet, boring hole effect if you're too close inside of a counter. So that's one of those things. I will say that stuff, it comes up. People do use them for that. And I think that if we have a happy medium, sometimes those people, because the message is to be seen by one person who's holding it for themselves, or it is, I would say, kind of magical thinking to the point where they're saying it means something that they have it on their person with this quote from a person who's important to them. It's inspirational. It isn't to be seen by anybody but the person holding it, and it's hidden most of the time. Definitely quotes on the inside of ties is another one, tie linings that I've done before. These kind of things are different. But when we're talking to a business, when we're talking to a sports team, when we're talking to a club, to a church, to the Boy Scouts, to someone who is doing something that it's expected to be seen. Now, maybe not scouting, maybe not, because that's something that's also meaningful to the person wearing it and maybe different that way. But if we're talking to someone who's using this for identification, then the discussion is more about, what do I need to fit in the space available? If I have to have it on a left chest and someone happens to have a very long name and I'm not allowed to stack that name, then maybe the micro fonts make sense because I'm trying to get inside of the space usable and I want it to be legible. But I can still have a discussion with them that the usual font set, the usual setup should be larger because we want it visible. And I'll give you the piece that I actually show sometimes, and a piece that I did for someone some time ago. And I think I'll just show you briefly kind of the use case for this. It's something I've taught. So you guys are you're getting slides from stuff I've taught and has been paid for before, but I think it's useful here and I feel like sharing it. So this was a thing that I taught at Impressions Expo, and I've taught a couple of times and shown this example. But let's just, and I'm framing it in this way. It's not exactly how the customer said it, but it is very close to how it turned out. If the customer is looking at this art, this is our original art. They want a 4-inch or less width on this left chest design. We're on light colored shirts at the time. This is when Piqué Polo ruled the earth with the rest of the dinosaurs. And so we have Piqué Polo shirts. They're light colored. We've got a fair amount of contrast. And they're going to say, okay, all this text has to be here no matter what. Anybody who's a digitizer in this room is looking at this already and saying, that is too wide. At 4 inches, that text underneath there, if it stays in that location, will be too small. It will not run correctly. And you're right. I don't think it's going to run well. And even if I can get it under there, maybe I'm doing straight stitch text. The instant they go to a dark shirt and tell me to reverse the colors, straight stitch text is going to look terrible. So I think I have to. Have I done lots of straight stitch text? Absolutely, I have. In this case, I'm going to ask them what's important first. That's the first thing I'm going to do is ask them what's important. I'm going to look at this first and say, hey, all those little shadows on the small letters, they're not going to run reliably. So let's try and eliminate them. They're not doing anything but confusing the piece. Also, the small text underneath it, not going to run well at this position. If it remains here, it's too small. So here are some options I provided in this case. Move the text out, rendered it at the smallest possible size, and then I put a decorative line in where the text used to be to actually fill the space and not leave an awkward gap. And then the second option, which I liked better, move the text and then render it at a legible size. This is in our safe, super safe range. Like now we're great. The first one is in our minimum safe range. Those letters are a little too small, but I've tweaked them. I've tuned them. They're going to run all right on the material I'm looking at. On the bottom right, this is bomb proof. It's going to run. I'm not concerned about it. It's great. So move the text over to here. It's a larger, more legible size. It works at the handshake distance. You can see where they're from. You can see they're a general contractor without any problems. And here's the thing. It depends on what's important to them. If they don't really care about this other text, the first thing to say, if you don't care about that text, why is it on there? If you do care about the text, do you want to make it visible to everybody or not? That's the thing. So if the customer considers their locality and the type of their business to be as important as the logo type, this ends up being the final version. In fact, the final version, we went larger. You go larger on general contractor and Oak Harbor, Washington. Why would you? Because it was more important to them and they wanted it to be clear that what we do, where we're located. Our locality is important because we work in our local area. What we do is important. It's the advertising for what this entire company is about. This is where we're dealing with the utility of the thing with the customer. What I'm still going to tell you is I'm still using that nice. Now, the flare serif was in the original piece. Quite luckily, this flare serif font is essentially what they were using on their logo. Lucky, because it was something that is available as a stock font. So wonderful. At the same time, I'm using a font that is very safe. I have this safe size that I've moved it to. I'm not going smaller than that, and I'm going to tell them that. There's no way it's running smaller than that, particularly on a textured material, particularly with a high range of contrast. When we're running a navy thread on a white garment, I'm not trying to mess around with that texture and with that contrast. But when we get over to the final version here, this is incredibly easy. This is more than easy. It's going to run perfectly, and it actually brings in what the customer's real desire was for the piece. So yes, I want to talk about small text. Yes, I want to talk about the technicality of it, using small threads, everything else. But you can never talk about small text without talking about what it's useful for. Like I said, this does not obviate the use of small text whatsoever. Small text is useful. Why are we using small text? Like I said, for things that need small text. If I have a piece like this, and this is certainly from the thread webinar. You may have seen me talk about this before. This is a 75 weight thread. If for some reason I must run this logo at this size, and it is absolutely imperative that I identify the logo, that the American Academy of Pediatrics must have this logo with this text on it because it is their identifiable logo. The type is part of the logo. I can argue for making this super tiny text. Now this, 75 weight thread is not necessary. This was done as kind of a tech demo, but when I ran the original for this, it still has to be done. That would still have to be done at the other size. Yes, it'd be a larger size, but I still have small text. I have the small O. I have some concessions that have to be made to make this run correctly. But this is part of the logo. It's part of the look, and it doesn't separate out very easily. This is something where I can argue for it. When we're talking about patches and badges, and I mean, this is an invented patch. Certainly, this is something that I just designed for the heck of it to show the concept. There is no Village of New Hamlin, I swear. I looked it up to make sure. But this is essentially the layout that you would see for NYPD. This is a layout that you see for lots of police departments. When they have central material, they have a standardized size that they're not going to change, and the gap is only so big around the edge of the patch. Well, now I need to fit into that gap. And I also, if I have a really long name, if this is Schenectady, New York, I'm going to have to deal with that long name in some way or another. Now microfonts make sense. Now pushing the limits makes sense. Now 60 weight thread may make sense in a way it's not taking away from anything. I'm not doing it because I've been forced. And honestly, yes, people already know what village you're in when you're being pulled over, I'm sure, but if it's something that you're expecting it to be identifiable, reasonably legible, but it has to stay within a certain size, you have a size constraint, that's when that micro lettering makes sense. Or like I said, you're doing something that really is small by nature, that is for someone to be read by them, or it's part of a logo type, of a seal, of a badge. And like I said, patches, badges, seals are one of the chief places where I used miniature small text. Sometimes things like division names, things that were necessary on medical garments is another one. Really small text because I had to include either the position the person worked in or the division they worked in. As a matter of identification, it had to be on their garment. It had to be visible. And because of the corporate rules or the corporate guidelines for their logo, it had to be a certain size smaller than the text that was in their logo type. In that case, I'm up against 3 or 4 things that I really can't alter very well. I can alter the overall size of the logo, but once I get to the utmost extreme of what they're going to allow me with the size of the logo, to get the ratio between the type that's in the logo and any appended type that I'm allowed to put in according to their corporate guidelines, I may have to use a microfont to do it. So I love microfonts. I love small lettering. Also caps, like I said before, if I go back and bring in the cap from the cap that we had from Karen Kuhn, which is that example that I showed earlier on. If I bring that back up, this piece was done much larger for other things. This was actually made into book binding, and the piece that was on the book binding was, was 5 inches square. It was huge. It was a large piece, really huge for what it was doing, and I digitized it as its own separate design. However, for this, on the cap, to get everything in, when I'm trying to deal with a limited vertical space, but I have essentially this bleeding heart that has this drop on the bottom that I can't eliminate, I've got a lot of vertical space. The heart's on fire, so we've got flames going up. It's got the bleeding drop on the bottom, so the drop's going down. And I have to fit, once again, within banners. I have borders that I can't stretch out and I can't eliminate. I have to fit inside of them or make the entire border larger. In this case, I didn't want to distort the art any more than I had to because the logo here was an actual original painted art piece made for the cover of her book. So these are good arguments for using micro fonts. I don't want to say they're not useful. They're incredibly useful when we need them. What I will say is when we don't need them, going all the way down to 60 weight thread, going down to 3 millimeters shouldn't be the first thing we look to do when we have small text in a logo. First thing we should look to do is see what's reasonable. Then when we find what is reasonable says, okay, I need 4 to 5 millimeter lettering underneath this piece. That's just what I have to do. Then we can start looking at what's available as far as microfonts, as far as our materials we can use, as far as any other kind of alterations we have to do. And as far as things like moving to a different kind of font with either doesn't have serifs or has in-column serifs or large slab serifs, as you see the large single thickness slab serifs sometimes can be useful because those will be, if you can get those to 1 millimeter, they will stay 1 millimeter. They don't have to taper. Whereas Times New Roman and Times style fonts like that may have these kind of bracketed serifs that have these that have kind of leading in slopes, the bracketing, and then have a tapered serif. Those are going to be much harder to achieve when they're super thin unless they're in column. These kind of alterations make sense when we're dealing with logos that require them, when we're dealing with text sizes that require them, that make sense, that still perform the function of the garment, perform the function of the logo, of the decoration for the end user, for the category we're in, for the client to which we're selling this, or for our own uses if it's something we're making for ourselves. But I would always encourage people to look toward legibility one way or the other. We can push things down to 3 millimeters. I find it to be pretty rare that we need to. And that most of the time, even with our micro fonts, we should probably size them up a little bit from their absolute minimums to run them, because we're just going to be more likely to get a result that we're happy with. So that's what I think. I'm going to go ahead and grab a couple more comments here before we finish out. And then I'll have some other, some news and some other stuff. Like I said, I'm going to mention some links and things that are coming up, and just kind of give you guys a little bit more on the fact that, we are going back to live education again. I know I'm a little nervous myself to get back to it, but I'll be traveling soon. But let's go ahead and grab a couple comments, and then we'll do that for sure. So let's first jump in with Mike, who says, I've also found that doing tiny text close to a hat brim, I've had to distort the whole line at the ends to maintain a linear appearance due to material deflection. Yeah. Over that center seam, we all know we're going to have material deflection. We know we're going to have a little bit of sway, I would call it, when we push the crown down to the needle plate. It's why it's so important that when we frame our hats, we do so in a way that gets them stabilized across the area we're going to embroider, attached to the vertical, especially if it's 270-degree modern cap frames, attached to that vertical post in the back with the stabilizer, so that we have a smooth surface to work on, and that we are careful with using underlay to marry the material to our stabilizer before we go running crazy, because that's all going to help us stay more stable. But close to a hat brim is one of the worst places for tiny text. Is one of the places we have to do it the most. Look at your overall verticality of that logo. Try and reduce size of the logo when you can. Move the type up when you can. And honestly, sometimes it makes sense to give someone a version of their piece where instead of text underneath a logo, you can do things like logo left, text right, or something of that nature, where we actually move the logo to a full height logo, move the text to a stacked version often that has more space in it. Truth of the matter is, you look at a lot of corporate guidelines, and they may have a horizontal and vertical version of a logo. You'll find people who they have a logo type and then type underneath will often also have a horizontal version of that for things like pens. They're usually made for things where you absolutely can't fit it on. Pens may have the logo moved over to one side and then text out from the horizontal aspect on that logo. That's the kind of look we can do on hats, because as we know, hey, especially on the military hats, we have a very limited vertical space with a fairly extensive horizontal space. Not everybody wants a big, huge logo, but when the type is absolutely too small and causing a lot of distortion, it's sometimes an option to present them with. At the very least, you can show them a similar logo type style to theirs and say, here's what it looks like if we throw bug on the left, text on the right, move the text up. This is where being a consultant is important rather than a commodity. We don't just reproduce exactly what's in front of our faces. We first give people the option for the best kind of embroidery they can get. And honestly, you'll often still have to use what I would consider a micro font or a mini font. I mean, some people say micro starts at 6 millimeters. You'll find people selling micro fonts 6 millimeters. I think you can get 6 millimeters out of the properly made keyboardable font. Those can be gotten down to 6 and 5, but they have to be made with that kind of eye and pretty cleanly for that to work out, and tested for that. Going down to stitch-based micros where they absolutely have to stay at individual sizes, I'm not doing that at 6. I consider 6 not really to be a micro yet, but you may need micro or miniature fonts in order to handle, honestly, any text, especially when we're talking about something like this. Visors is another one coming up into summer, depending on who's still doing visors, camp hats, anything military hats that has that vertical limited space. You may find yourself needing a font of this nature for sure. And honestly, hey, just long names, even when we're talking about left chest or right chest presentations for personalization. Long names sometimes just require a micro font or a condensed font that is tall but narrow so we can fit in that limited horizontal space. Remember, it's holistic. Part of what we're dealing with is the amount of space we have to put the decoration in. So that's one of those things we have to deal with. One more comment here. Carol says, thank you for sharing the faux pas you've learned from. It's nice to have some of the things validated that I believe to be true and what I've explained to my customer. Yeah, I mean, and here's the truth of the matter. Yes, there are the abilities to get really small with text. Not every customer, not every job, and especially not at every price, who doesn't merit you pulling individual stitches, moving things around, doing a bunch of design work necessarily to get them exactly to what they want. Can you babysit a garment at half speed and force every little thing to run? You might, but it's not always the right choice. And often the right choice is to talk to them about the end user, the end viewer, and say, what is this for? What is its intention? Should we go bigger with the text or not? Here are some options for what that might look like if you have something similar, especially. And here's what, if I run the text in the incredible small size that you're asking, so they can understand the realities of small text using thread. The fun rule has always been for me with 40 weight thread. If you can take a brand new sharp crayon out of the box and write something in your font, then you can have it. It's not quite true. It can get a little finer than that. But if you look at a brand new box of crayons, the end of that box, that crayon is usually around 1 millimeter, 1.2, 1.5 millimeters. It's a pretty good rule of thumb. And it's something to explain to a customer, say, this is the kind of line quality we can get out of a satin stitch, out of the classic stitch you expect this font to be in. You want to go much finer. You want to taper off. You want to do any sort of fancy work there. You want to do scripts that have thick and thin lines, things like that. We may have to do some alteration to get it to work, or we can get a little smaller with specialty thread, and there may or may not be a surcharge depending on how you want to work on that. Certainly, we know that we need increased density to get the same amount of coverage, even with good underlays and everything else on 6-8 threads. So we're going to have a higher stitch count that's going to cost a little bit if we're charging by stitch count, or if we're charging by time, because that's still time. Time, stitch count, both of these things are going to result in a higher charge for that kind of work. But that's an added value. And part of what it is up to us to do is make things clear to our customers, explain value, and sell our product, and explain what things are worth and what they're for. I mean, that's the thing. Help them, guide them, get them to where they need to be. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and give you guys, once again, links list is up. If you need guys need to get to that, here it is. It has some of those great videos there, and also has some other interesting things. One of the things I would love to just go ahead and share, Christine Shreve asked me to go ahead and give this a share, and I fully agree with that. If you want to check out where Aaron Montgomery is going to be, see Christine. You guys might know Lindsay Salcedo from there. Applique Getaway is coming up July 23rd through 25th. And that's one of the first shows that's really going to come out where we have kind of that, we have a range of everyone from craft to cottage industry to small business who are going to be there. And so that's a really good one to go to. If you didn't see Two Regular Guys this morning, we had a great episode on that. So check out appliquegetaway.com. That's also, you'll see Lisa Shaw there teaching. If you want to meet Lisa Shaw, who is an awesome educator, she's there at Applique Getaway as well. I won't be at Applique Getaway, but believe me, I'll be thinking about it while you guys are all out there in Texas. So go out there, Irving, Texas, Applique Getaway, July 23rd to 25th. Something to look forward to. Grab a chance at that. Check out what's going on at appliquegetaway.com. Great education, and apparently a sold out floor. So vendors and everybody are there and ready to see you in Texas. So Applique Getaway is one thing I wanted to share with you guys. Like I said previously, if you missed the patch class, 4 hours of patch digitizing, patch borders, how edges work, software, dealing with the execution on patches, the different kinds of materials we can do to do small run patches in-house, how to sell them, the different kinds of patches we can outsource. Like I said, a 4-hour marathon with breaks about patches. If you want to get that, it's right now available at decorators.education/emblems as a recording without the live interaction and stuff. You will still be able to get downloads and things like that, but you will not have the live interaction. It'll just be the recording. But hey, 4 hours of that material that can teach you quite a bit. And actually, I wanted to appreciate this real quick. Thank you, Jeff, who earlier gave me a very nice comment on that and said, it was definitely a great class. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on stabilizing microfonts on dry fit garments. Yeah, what I'm going to say about that, stabilizer on microfonts, same as anything with dry fit garments. We just want to make sure it is married to the garment. I have gone to the point of adhering or fusing it sometimes, depending on dry fit garments. Certainly, also, I've used wash away on top, wash away films. We had somebody else ask, does it still hold up after it washes away? Part of what it's doing is holding the thread above the material during the loop formation. As we form the loop and it's cinching down into the material, instead of it sinking down into the material, the film is holding it up. So when it washes away, that amount of thread is still there and it's not cinching down any tighter than that. So yes, it still does something. Does it stabilize after it's gone? No. Does it provide loops that aren't sunken down into the material? Yes. So that's something to think about. So in any case, check that out. If you want to see all the patch stuff that was there and get kind of a preview of some of that, and hey, learn how to make little patches like this of your own on your machine, no matter what equipment you have. And some of the reasons why to do it, once again, go check that out at decorators.education/emblems if you'd like to. You'll get all the links to that. And of course, the original free class that only ran once, Why Patches, that will also be included if you purchase this. And let us know if you don't get your emails on any of those links. So Applicate Getaway's coming up. That's coming up. You're also going to find that I will be at the DAX shows. So coming up quite soon, go check it out at daxshow.com. So the first one's in Kansas City next month, early next month. We have Kansas City coming up. After that, we've got Minneapolis, Minnesota. Actually, we have Treasure Island, Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis, about an hour. So at the casino at Treasure Island. Also, the Chicagoland area and Tinley Park later on. So all three of those DAX shows, I'll be teaching a class very similar. It's somewhat like my original Demystifying Digitizing class with an update. It's something they asked me to teach again. Apparently, a lot of people were unhappy they didn't get to see that one. And so it will be similar to that course. So that's going to be out there. Again, I'll be doing kind of the 3 to 4 hour workshop format, very much like the patch class. So that's happening at DAX. And actually, thereafter, I'm also going to be at the Impressions Expo show in Fort Worth. So you may see me, and actually you'll see Jeff Fuller of Embroidery Nerd and Fuller Embroidery Works out there as well. And I'll be teaching specialty thread there, as well as being on the Madeira panel, the excellent embroidery panel with Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd. So that should be really cool. A lot of your reciprocator friends and Embroidery Nerd friends and fans in the same place. So with that, folks, I'm going to call it. We are well into bonus time. I know we can cover this again. If there are other things you want to see, if there are other things you want to discuss, by all means, let me know. Get in the comments, contact me anywhere you find me. And if we have something that we can discuss later, even if it's this topic again, I'm not going to do it next week, but we will do it again, because I think we're all coming to a better understanding every time we look at this together, every time we discuss. And by the way, all of you reciprocators, reason we call you that, because you give back and because you, like the reciprocator in the machine, are the most important part of this thing. You keep the needles going up and down. So thank you for that. Every time we talk about it, every time we come together, we learn something new. And I am happy to cover anything you guys want to cover that makes sense for you in the world of embroidery, embroidery digitizing, software, e-commerce, sales, garment decoration. Let me know. And if I don't know about it, I'll find you someone who does and figure something out to teach. All right. So with that, folks, really happy to have had you here. We'll definitely be talking about this again, but go check out the links list, go check out the other videos, and I can't wait to see you again next Friday.